Hello, my name is Ote Korkala from Ricardo AEA. Thank you for the very interesting report, and apologies, I haven't read it carefully, so maybe I have missed these points that I want to raise. First of all, about the methodology. Did you have to make some assumptions about financial flows, for example, private finance and also adaptation finance? Sometimes there's, these scenarios that low ambition will kind of lead to more adaptation finance. So did you have to make these assumptions? And then about the message and kind of how to take this forward. I think there's a bit of risk that, development economists for decades have tried to figure out how to, and other scientists and colleagues, how to alleviate poverty. And one decade it was all about health, next decade it was all about education, and then good governance, whatever. And I think there's a little bit of risk that now kind of climate becomes this. I personally truly believe for this and for the connection, but not to overly simplify issues, just to kind of recognize these other, to make it more kind of robust and.
Great, thanks very much. Fantastic report. You've mentioned it's Tony Simons, Director General from the World Agroforestry Centre ICRAF, based in Kenya. Fantastic report. You've mentioned it's a political process. Now, politicians have 900,000 pieces of evidence, published evidence, to support change. And so this is another 1.1 part per million into that evidence bucket. How do we connect your report and socialize it with the public? Because you've mentioned all of the meetings that are coming up this year. We've also got an El Nino coming this year, a moderate to high El Nino. And is that time to piggyback on this and to socialize it, because politicians respond to the public? And poverty is, pardon the pun, a poor term. And we need to relate that to social poverty and environmental poverty and human poverty as much as financial poverty in these connections that we're going to see with food shortages and droughts in India and other parts of the world. So I'd be keen to hear on how you see the ability to connect those messages through, even simple ones. For 5,000 generations, climate has shaped human endeavor. And now we're in an era where human endeavor is shaping climate. And that's insurance policy that we need through these huge investments that are coming forward, are really a trigger that you've got to get out there using this wonderful report and extra evidence you have.
Great. I'll take couple more questions, and good provocations there, Tony. Tom Mitchell, who's right down at the end.
Thank you, Sam. Tom Mitchell from ODI. Just thinking about the comments that were made in relation to the timescale here to 2030 with the SDGs, I think the slightly uncomfortable truth for the report itself here is that it actually matters not one jot what happens in Paris for the likely achievement or not of the 2030 targets of the SDGs, primarily because the climate change that we will experience over that time frame has already been baked in. It doesn't really matter what emissions happen between now and 2030. The period is already set. And of course, we are casting our eye back to the historic emissions we've had and the likely impacts we will experience over that time period, where all the best science tells us that it's unlikely to be significant in terms of the climate signal, certainly compared to a number of other drivers. And I think that's where, for me, the attraction to the type of argument that Ilby is presenting is really important, because of course, it matters a huge amount what the outcome is in Paris for the likely ability to stick to the results of the SDGs and whether or not poverty reduction advancements will not be reversed into the future. And I just wanted to really ask the report's authors about this delicate balance of messaging, really, between tying these two agendas together. Because it's actually rather complicated in timeframes, and the IPCC really challenged themselves on this as well, talking about periods of committed climate change and periods of choices and carbon budgets, and it really goes back to the point that was made previously about the communications aspect here. And I think Andrea also picked it up that the messaging is quite tough to get across, and just wanted to get your reflections on how you dealt with that.
Good, Tom. Well, I'll turn back to the report authors, but would also welcome comments from Neville and the other panellists on this issue of timing. But there's some clarification points as well. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yes. The ones which are top of my head are the ones which came last, so we can start with those. In terms of the methodology, you asked a question about yes, we did in the report, and I think if you read it, there is some discussion about adaptation finance and the likelihood of different levels of finance being part of the agreement in Paris, and that makes a difference to the way in which we see poverty and other SDGs being influenced by the agreement in Paris. And that's partly, in a sense, the answer I'd give to Tom. That, you know, of course, you're right that in terms of impacts, it won't make a difference to what the frequency of particular kinds of events or the severity of those events, what we agree in Paris between now and 2030. But what is agreed in Paris could have two major effects, which are pathways by which economies could be influenced. One is the impetus that will be given by this huge low-carbon infrastructure development program that has been elaborated, for example, in the New Economy report. Now, if that does materialize as a result of the Paris Agreement, and Paris Agreement gives it the support that it needs, then that can make a big difference in terms of what comes out. And the other thing which can make a big difference is the commitment that we get on adaptation finance. Because at the moment we have a lot of areas where adaptation is needed to try and reduce the impact of climate impacts on poverty and on some of the other SDGs, and that I think has a better chance if that finance is more secure, it's clearer, and it's more part of the budgetary planning that we have for these countries. The issue of the political process, how can we connect to the public? I would revert, I think perhaps somebody else may be able to say more on that. And yes, this is we will have the El Nino effect, probably more in Asia than it will be in Africa, but yes. And then that is likely to see the kind of droughts that we have experienced. And maybe this is a good time to bring to people's attention the fact that addressing, in some ways, ensuring that the development finance is in place to be able to deal with these things is a key part of the process and agreement. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, this issue about timing and communication is important.
I agree. And the science, the IPC, is saying that there won't be a great difference between 2015 and 2030. So I accept, and I think one of the key things that we were trying to do in this study was differentiate it from a climate impact study. And there's a whole host of those that are looking at longer term timescales, 2050, 2080 up to 2100. And I think one of the key things behind the work was not to do that, but to look at how the climate agreement potentially is given political signals, it's given a global push towards particular development pathways, that they are actually then picked up at national level and implemented, and action is taken nationally and locally. And then it also links in with the finance question. So also the outcome of the climate agreement will we don't know what, but it will potentially put money on the table, etc. So I think all those factors are relevant to the climate agreement, and therefore I think we shouldn't be saying that the outcome of the Paris climate agreement is not relevant to future development in that way.
Yes, Andrea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just important to be clear about what the deal might involve. I mean, on one level, the deal will involve a set of aggregated INDCs, which give you a level of commitment, which translate into projected temperature changes. But it's also a whole lot of other things as well. So the review, the ratchet mechanisms, potential rules as well, all of that is really critical. And the architecture behind that then is absolutely essential. So I would really strongly dispute anyone who says it doesn't matter for the next 15 years. It's about setting up a whole way of doing things for the next 15 years, which could be radically different. But then I think the finance as part of that is a really important part of it. And you can already see very tangibly the Green Climate Fund that has already mobilised 10.2 billion in pledges. And already 43% of that has been translated into actual contributions that have been signed by governments. That would not have been catalysed at that speed if it hadn't been for the forthcoming Paris COP. So I think there's something about a sense of urgency which really is accelerating finance flows very clearly if you look at the GCF. And I think the really important point is on infrastructure. There is about a 90 billion trillion gap, I think, on infrastructure at the moment. And you can see the conversations, the World Bank issuing reports on billions to trillions, thinking about that infrastructure gap. The climate conversation and Paris is going to alter significantly to the extent to which those that infrastructure finance is lower carbon. And it will significantly alter what money is actually put on the table, mobilised from the private sector. So I think actually the idea of suggesting that it's irrelevant for the next 15 years is not true. I think it will make a fundamental difference to what actually is delivered on the ground in many poor countries and really transform lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly this is a report that's trying to say this period of 15 years is incredibly relevant, and it's incredibly relevant for poverty reduction. And I think what's striking, there's real numbers about real people in here that are affected by the choices made in Paris, including the modelling of climate finance, which I think is an interesting part of the approach, which you'll see in the report. I would definitely like to go back to Neville in a moment on the issue of messaging and communicating into politics, because I think that's coming up here. But maybe I can turn to Jonathan Reeves from IIED, because you just published a paper on this, and we talk about adaptation finance and things like that, which are very dear to the heart of your colleagues in IIED. So maybe, Jonathan, your comments could build on this.
Thanks very much, Sam. So, yeah, I'm Jonathan Reeves from IIED, where I work on the post-2015 agenda. We've just published a paper here. There's some copies outside, as a collaboration with Salim Huck, who couldn't be here today, but with, as many of you will know him, and Helena, who's a consultant that is also here. And it's on the impact of climate change on the least developed countries as a specific group, and the implications for their ability to achieve the SDGs. It's more of a literature review, which is then infused with our understanding and knowledge of what the LDCs are looking for out of these upcoming agreements and the particular challenges that they face. We've looked goal by goal at what the IPCC Fifth Assessment has to say and other sources of evidence. We've been slightly less strict with ourselves on the issue of the timeline, because this is a fairly literature review, it's not new work. But talking about the timeline, I think it's clear that if your country is at risk of being submerged by a sea level rise within a couple of generations, you're not going to be even thinking about achieving the SDGs by 2030. You're going to be leaving the country. So I think there is clearly a relationship between the level of ambition on maintaining temperature rise below a certain temperature and the ability to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So, as I say, we go through the goal by goal, but the key sort of recommendations and conclusions we make are that climate change will undermine the LDC's ability to meet all of the goals. We highlight a subset that we say the evidence is particularly robust that there will be impact, but it will actually undermine the ability to achieve all of the goals because of the extent of the implications across them. And therefore, particularly because the impacts of climate change, as you know, are differentiated, exacerbate existing power imbalances, vulnerabilities. The LDCs are particularly vulnerable, and along similar lines of thinking, there's particular implications for women and children, the gender dimension. So therefore, we say in order for the LDCs to have a chance of achieving the SDGs, whether that's by 2030 or ever, frankly, the new climate agreement must limit global warming below 2 degrees and provide adequate additional financing and compensation for loss and damage, which has already occurred, and it goes beyond limits of adaptation. Beyond that, we say that looking at the financing, so the implications of climate change are not just that the goals will be harder to achieve, but they're much more expensive to achieve. And if we look at LDCs and the challenges they're facing already, in particular, we see that the obligation to pay back debts that's going on. We've seen, for example, through the Ebola crisis, how the ability of these the 3 countries at the epicenter of the Ebola crisis to develop health systems has been undermined by their ongoing need to pay back debts. So these LDCs should not be obliged to pay or to prioritize payment of debts over financing the achievement of the SDGs. Certainly not until developed countries have met their ODA commitments, like the United Kingdom, and also gone beyond that and met the additional climate debts as a term which probably deserves a bit more detail. But the idea being that climate debts go above and beyond this 0.7% commitment that was made before these climate discussions started.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the final point is that the analysis of the impact of climate change on the ability of different countries to achieve the SDGs should be factored into the assessments of the financing required and the allocation of the financing. And this is something that the Addis Ababa conference should agree, and it should be factored in and targeted to those countries that would be whose ability to achieve the SDGs would be most hampered by climate change. And just finally, to talk about this additionality and separation, we think that climate finance should be deployed synergistically with development finance and without distinction between them in the implementation. But in terms of the accounting, in order to ensure that these commitments are achieved, there does need to be separate accounting and additionality of climate finance above and beyond ODA commitments.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Jonathan. Neville, any comments from you at this stage?
Just a comment on the, which I didn't make, the 2030 horizon. I think it's one of the challenges we have with getting action on climate change is the language we use and the sort of horizon we talk about, 2 degrees by 2100, etc. That doesn't engender the type of reaction that you would like to see. But by putting it at the 2030 timeline, it allows our policymakers to connect to something, because a lot of, I'm speaking about the Caribbean, a lot of them now have statements about development, Vision 2030, Vision 2025. So it falls within that, that time frame. And I think this would be a useful vehicle, basically, to get action from them. The other important issue is how do we convince our political directorate to have some action on climate change? And the way we do it is to try and align action, climate action, with development. And showing the opportunities, basically, that climate action affords to answer some developmental challenges. Very quickly, an example is with water. Our models and everything show that the Caribbean, this is one of the biggest challenges we'll face, water scarcity in the region. The ideal adaptation response is how do we increase the access to water, the volume of water. But when you look around the Caribbean, most of our countries have a leakage of about 50%, some 64% in the system. And so we are now convincing governments that, look, we can frame the addressing leakage as an adaptation option. You have to find a way to make that link between climate change and something that our political people understand. I think that's one of our biggest challenges.
Neville, thank you. Your tips and steers on how to communicate this into the politics and the reality of the development challenges are extremely helpful. I'd like to ask Anil and Nigel just to pick up on two of the points that you'd made, Andrea. One was around the gender results that are emerging from this study, and also the links with these broader growth diagnostics that differed in the World Bank are doing. Which of you wants to pick up on either of those?
I'll pick up initially on the gender. In terms of the study itself, in particular the country case studies, we did in fact look to SDG 5, so achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls. So we did look at that as one of our 4 SDGs, and I think we felt that that was appropriate and that it was important within the wider picture. I think with all the SDGs, it's very difficult to disaggregate them into little silos, and they actually cut across all areas of development, social, economic, and environmental, etc. We were conscious that it may be a slightly wider issue, that, and it relates to financing, that in fact not just international financing, we're also trying to look at implications of the ambition on domestic financing, and potentially could that have negative impacts in some sectors. And so we did look at that question about whether it could impact negatively on gender inequalities, etc. But we did try to look at as well where the positive gains could be made.
On the question of the diagnostic work, to be honest, we did look at some work that the World Bank was doing, particularly for Uganda and Pakistan, and the projections they had under different scenarios for the next 20 odd years, 2 decades. So, and we did include that work in our estimate. We didn't look at the DFID diagnostic. We'd be happy to do that if that's available. But what was interesting was that their assessment of kind of business as usual wasn't so different from what we had come up with using the shared socioeconomic pathways. And the idea was that if we go for a high ambition scenario, we have a possibility of going slightly up. If we go for a low ambition scenario, we have a likelihood of going slightly down from that picture.
Great, thank you. One more appeal for questions for those online. They don't seem to have come through, so if anyone has any questions online, I'd love to see them. In the room, I have a question from Helena Wright. Anybody else as well? Andrew, so let's start with Helena.
Hi. I just had a quick point to add to that made by Jonathan. I was involved with the report looking at the impacts of climate change on the SDGs for least developed countries. And I think that my point was that it might be the other side of the coin, really, in terms of this report's pointing out the benefits of climate change action on economic growth, etc. But that in terms of that being a sort of virtuous circle, there might also be a sort of vicious cycle that could occur if we don't actually manage the impacts of climate change, if we don't hit the target of 2 degrees in Paris, then countries won't actually have the finance to actually invest in their own development, and that will undermine the resources that are needed for the investment there. And in particular, this paper pointed out in water, there was particularly strong evidence from the IPCC report, also for poverty and health, but also in particular the oceans, which might be is an area, particularly for some of these countries that we've talked about, like the Caribbean, if we don't hit the sort of 2 degree target. So that was just my final point on that.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Scott from ODI. The discussion so far has focused very much on the strength of the ambition in the Paris Agreement. The report also suggests that a good or a strong SDG agreement, which is before Paris, might also be beneficial. I'd like to invite the panelists to comment a little bit on that, because listening to the discussion, it seems that actually the decisions in terms of addressing the climate change problem are all going to happen in Paris. And what would a strong SDG agreement look like? And have we actually got one from this particular perspective? Second thought is thinking beyond both Paris and New York, where certainly many people are going to say we will end up with imperfect agreements in both cases. How can the kind of conclusions that this report is generating, or maybe the 0-0 narrative that was outlined, be used to kind of then reinforce the need for further action?
Thank you. Great questions, Andrew. I've got a question here and 1, 2 here. I'll probably work across these 3 and stop. So write down the questions, folks, or you'll forget them.
Hello, my name's Layla from Global Witness. Just a question around, did the report take into account the fact that poverty and environmental destruction is really linked to corruption and lack of governance, particularly around natural resources? So did it take into account that SDGs could be undermined by the fact of future corruption and the same corrupt individuals undermining those sustainability goals or development goals? So also particularly development plans taken into looking to increase natural resources being exploited. So for example, industrial scale logging and increased oil digging. Did it take into account that and the impact on the climate?
Thank you. 2 more questions, and we'll come back to the panelists. Gentleman there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Diego Martinez. I work for CAFOD, following the post-2015 agenda, specifically climate and energy, actually. So this was very, very interesting. I have 3 very quick questions. First one would be, you're saying that in order to achieve the SDGs or achieve a good climate outcome or Paris Agreement, we need strong SDGs, but I didn't hear what that means. Like, what does it mean to have strong SDGs? I mean, we know at this point that, as you pointed out, that we pretty much know already what we have on the table. Does it mean we have to focus maybe on the declaration for communication or purposes, or the second question is more for Andrea. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry about the question, but I need to make it. Is the UK still planning to advocate for a reduction of number of goals in case the Open Work Group report gets reopened after Addis, which is still a possibility in July and August? And the third question is for everyone. It's basically about implementation. Next week we have the intergovernmental negotiations on follow-up and review. So I was wondering if there has been any thinking around coherence between UNFCCC and post-2015 follow-up and review and accountability measures. For example, for coherence, for trying to coordinate timeframes, protocols, reviews, and all that sort with MRV. Thank you.
One more, last question. Really short, if we're going to get you 2 in, but we'll stop with that.
My name's Kathy Watson, and I'm also from the World Agroforestry Centre. I noticed that the slides on Uganda talked about developing a modern energy sector and phasing out the high dependence on traditional biomass. Well, at the World Agroforestry Centre, we think that biomass can be produced sustainably, and we have a tree-based energy policy, which we're happy to share with anybody. And in fact, I wonder who the researchers spoke to in Uganda, because Uganda has a superb biomass, bioenergy policy strategy paper, and if anybody would like it, I can give you my card and I can forward that along with our own policy.
CGIR is in town. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. My name is Martin Monene Brown, Commonwealth Scholar at King's College London, studying disasters, adaptation and development. I want to applaud first. This is a very important study, especially at this point in time when we are talking about all these things and trying to achieve this. But my focus or my concern seems to, or is directed to the silos that we are discussing all these things in.
Yeah.
The gentleman from Belize has talked about the discussions on SDGs being separate, or the negotiators of climate change not being involved in the SDGs. So I want to ask, what do you think is the future of this, of these silos? Are we still going to continue discussing disaster risk reduction separate from climate change and separate from development? I am raising this a few days ago at Sendai. The conference people sat down and adopted a Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which was not very mindful of the climate change. It just mentioned it, but nothing much out of it. And finally, I would want to know how we really link climate change discussions, the discourses on climate change, with livelihoods. Because I think in sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about emissions. Very few people would even understand what you're talking about. Link this with the livelihoods. Link this, don't even call it development. Let it be livelihoods. And I think it has been mentioned relating to food and all these things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this is a very good start of the discussion.
Okay, well, Martin, you've opened up a huge conversation. And I would just say that as CDKN, I would love to talk more to you because you're sorting out all the things that we aspire to work on. We've worked in Sendai to try and bring the climate and development dimensions. We work hard on the issues of interconnections, development, livelihoods and climate change, but those silos still exist. Even in the Caribbean, we heard very explicitly from Dr. Trotz earlier. So that mission is one that we share. So I'd like to turn perhaps to the authors first of all, but then the other panelists on the various issues. So there's a lot about the SDGs to Paris in that connection.
Well, I'll try and, if I can get the various points that you made on the question on from Global Witness and lack of governance. We didn't look at that issue. We hadn't addressed the SDGs being undermined by corruption or exploitation. On the case of the example from Uganda, biomass, the point we are involved in a study in Uganda, and we're aware that there's a big gap between the supply and demand for biomass, and this cannot be filled from the electricity generation program 2030. So we have to do something to improve the efficiency of biomass, and it is, in our view, clearly an important and critical part of meeting the energy needs. And so we agree with you entirely that biomass has to have an important role in the structure. But of course, they are also very keen to move towards other sources of energy as well. The question from Andrew about what are the possible effects of the SDGs on the climate agreement is important. And certainly, if we make progress on the energy goals, on the water goal, and of course there is also a climate change goal in there, then those will contribute to the to the attainment of a higher ambition scenario. We haven't quantified those so much in the paper, but the linkages are both ways, and we could, if we had the opportunity, if we had time, look at the development further. But your other point is that this story isn't going to end in Paris, and I agree with you that this is anything which if an agreement comes out of that, I sincerely hope it does, it will be imperfect, and there will be the room to make further changes. And both of these pieces of work, the 0-0, as well as the work that we've been doing, should, I hope, contribute to the ongoing debate on this subject.
Andrew, you put on the spot. Can you answer that question about number of goals?
Some of you will be aware we had an election recently, and we've clearly got a slightly new government back. So I think it's probably their responsibility, not mine, to restate the government's position, or whether how the government's position may have changed slightly under the new majority government. So, you know, clearly you have to watch this space and wait for the negotiations next week in New York to see what the government's stated position is on that. In terms of implementation, and also in terms of the relationship between the SDGs and the COP, I mean, I think there has to be a bit of a realism that struck me when I first started working for government about just how long things take. So a lot of this stuff, it may be in September for the 2015, and it may be Paris in December, but an awful lot of it is actually being discussed right now, or last week, or last month. Very, very long lead times on a lot of this stuff. So I think there's got to be a bit of a reality about how much is still open for discussion, and how much of it is actually going to be in the communication and the presentation and the nuance around the edges, as much as some of the fundamental kind of substance. Then I think the issue of the review mechanism is a really critical one, and FFD is obviously part of that, and the means of implementation and setting that through. So yes, as I said, we have a lot of very active conversations about FFD and how that goes forward, and what the means of implementation means, and how the review mechanisms might tie into the COP, and what the sustainability issues running through the SDGs mean in practice, and how you relate those then to the climate deal. I mean, it's quite an obvious subject for debate. But I'm interested also in the comments about Sendai, because my understanding was that actually there were an awful lot of climate change negotiators at Sendai. And there were an awful lot of climate change negotiators there, making sure that Sendai and any conclusions there very much were about setting up for the COP later this year. And in fact, it was a very sophisticated climate change conversation and politics going on at play. How that translated into final declarations or final output is probably exactly the result of the complicated politics behind it, and a kind of long game that's going out through this year.
Ilmi.
Just to respond, especially to Andrew's comment about what this sort of means for prioritization looking beyond the SDGs, and I would just suggest that the SDGs are what they are. The Sustainable Development Goals are what they are. There is a degree to which we're baked into a particular set of 169 targets, et cetera. But we should also acknowledge what they don't do, which is galvanize us around a strategy. Michael Porter, the father of corporate strategy, said that strategy means what you don't do. And the Sustainable Development Goals don't tell us what we don't do. And so there's still room, I would say, for political entrepreneur countries to focus on something and say, behind these are a set of priorities that we're going to measure, and measure our own success against. There were two features that made the Millennium Development Goals effective when written in a basement by a handful of people across the street from the UN Secretariat. They were intended to be universal, and they were measurable. And I would suggest that actually the connection between climate and poverty makes it universal. It means that every country, in its commitment to sustainable development, itself has to aim for low carbon development, including wealthy countries, and to eradicate poverty at home and abroad, and that those are both measurable goals. And so I don't think that's perfect. I think that's two goals. It's not really perfect. It has implications about inequality and reducing inequality if we're going to achieve those goals together. But we should really focus on something that we can cling to, and not look to the SDGs to do that. They are what they are. They will be what they will be. It is a great articulation of all the things that we care about. But let's pick some things and really swing for them. That, to me, is what ambition looks like on the sustainable development agenda.
Okay, well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. This is a big topic, and I think we've done more than skim over the surface. I think we've got into some of it, but it's one that could definitely go on. So I'd like to thank everyone online, and thank everyone for being here this afternoon. There's a kind of what next here. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation between CDKN and yourselves, because I think we all share the same interests here. I think there's some particular challenges around communicating this, as has come up this afternoon. We have a number of colleagues who are professional knowledge management and communication and media people in the room, but we'd welcome your suggestions. Dr. Mokandia will be presenting this at the Paris Our Common Future conference. Nigel will be presenting this. One of you, between you. You will be presenting this in the Paris Climate Science Conference between the 7th and 10th of July, which is great. But it is a contribution, needs to be seen in the round of the work that you're doing and we're doing. It can't be seen in isolation, I think. And in that, it's a contribution that's very much on DFID's agenda to this interconnection. So thank you very much. I might just give a quick word to Neville to say thank you very much indeed for joining us. And we look forward to more inputs. But thank you, Neville, very much. So thank you to Andrea and our panelists. Thank you very much.